I want to ask first, how many astrologers do we have in the group here? Okay, a few. That's good. What I want to talk about, well, first I'm going to begin with a quote. This is a William Gibson who's famous for the book Neuromancer, amongst other things, and he wrote a statement once. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And we're going to come back to this as we go on here. But what I'm going to talk about here tonight is something I've been interested in and studying for over 30 years. In fact, since the first time I came here to the Society was in the 70s to hear Dane Rudyard speak over in this room, right over there when the podium was over there. And I've been following this subject, studying it, and what I'm going to try to do here tonight is distill that down into about 60 minutes or so. We'll see, how that goes. But I want to begin by asking you to engage in a simple thought experiment. Try to imagine what the perspective of the world would be if you were an ant crawling on stage during a play, during a Shakespeare play, for example. All around you, there's this complex drama unfolding with dramatic sounds and rich colors, dramatic events. But because you don't understand the language, you don't understand the story being told, it all seems like just a chaotic jumble of disconnected events. If you understood the language, if you understood the story, you'd see that all the different events, the sounds, the images, the story, it all fits together. And I bring that up because I think it's a good way to describe our predicament on the world stage in terms of our place in world history. It's as though we are in this complex, vast drama with billions of actors, and all these things are happening, but it seems like a chaotic jumble of events, and that's because we don't understand the language. We don't understand the story being told. If we did, we'd understand that those events, that the geological upheavals, the political changes, the triumphs and the tragedies all come together in a sort of cohesive whole. And astrology gives us a way to understand that story, that language. It gives us several ways, actually. And the main one that I want to talk about here is the idea of the great ages. And that's, in very simplest terms, that's the idea that history can be broken down into roughly 2,000-year chapters. And that as these chapters unfold, maybe about 2100, it's an approximation. We don't know exactly how long they are. It depends on various factors astronomically. But in a nutshell, it has to do with this idea that as the vernal point, you see the first day of spring at the sunrise, you have the sun against a certain point of the sky, against a certain constellation. And as time, every 72 years, you have that vernal point, the point of the first day of spring, the first moment of spring. That point moves backwards through the constellations because of the way the Earth is wobbling. And it moves through the constellations, and as it does, there's a shift in the world mythologies, a shift in the values and the symbols of culture. And, a lot of books, if you study the great ages in terms of essays or books or lectures, they tend to focus on the astronomical dynamics a lot. I don't want to talk about that so much. I want to talk here mainly about the meaning of the great ages. What do these things mean in terms of the shifts between the different ages? But before I do, I have to clear up a couple of misconceptions, misunderstandings maybe. One is the idea that some people feel that it's not even a legitimate phenomenon. Of course, astronomers don't think that the great ages have an astrological significance. Everybody tends to agree that there is such a thing as precession of the equinox. Precession as opposed to procession. Pre means backwards. It has to do with that vernal point moving backwards through the constellations. So everybody agrees that that's a real phenomenon, but astrologers believe that that has a symbolic meaning. Astrologers believe that that has significance in terms of world affairs. And not even every astrologer believes that. Some believe that it's an overblown sort of concept. For example, the great Theosophical astrologer Charles Carter, and he was a great astrologer, He wrote, "It's probable that there is no branch of astrology on which more nonsense has been poured forth than the doctrine of the precession of the equinoxes." The funny thing is, I agree with him, insofar as there has been a lot of nonsense written about it. But there's also been a lot of nonsense written about God. That doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It just means there's a lot of nonsense out there about it. The other thing that you sometimes find is this idea that it's an overly simplistic notion. My colleague, brilliant Nick Campion, was saying that the notion of the precession of the equinoxes, the great ages, it's a very, he didn't use the word simplistic, but he said you can't boil down the complexities of history into these 2,000-year brackets. I agree with that too. And that's why, in fact, his idea was that you have to look at planetary cycles. That's a very important factor, like when Jupiter, Saturn, and Saturn come together, or, for example, Pluto, Neptune, or various other planetary cycles. That's a more microscopic way of looking at the flow of history. And I agree with that, but that's why I couple the two together. I think you have to bring the great ages together with the planetary cycles, because the planetary cycle approach is also very simplistic. If I ask you, for example, what was life like back in 3100 BC? What are you going to do to figure out what that's like? Are you going to look at the patterns of Jupiter, Saturn at the time? Are you going to look at Uranus, Pluto, Pluto, Neptune, things like that? That will give you certain insights into the period. But it's kind of like going into a Shakespeare play and hearing a few lines of dialogue, but not knowing the context, not knowing the stage setting, not knowing the scene itself, maybe just knowing the individual moments. That's what the planetary cycles tend to be like. The great ages give you the stage set. They give you the context in which those planetary cycles unfold. The bottom line is, if you look at history for the last few thousand years, at least for the last 6,000 years, you see some very striking correspondences between what happened in history and the great ages. And what I want to do here tonight is go over some of these examples of mainly the Piscean age and the Aquarian age, because we don't quite have enough time to go much more into the earlier stages. Plus, we only have a limited amount of information about prior to the age of, well, we have the age of Aries, but before that it gets very murky. So I want to begin with the age of Pisces here. And what does the age of Pisces mean? What significance did this have in culture? We have to look at a few things, and the first thing we have to decide is, when did it begin? So, for instance, most astrologers, not all, most astrologers would say that the age of Pisces began around the birth of Christ, give or take a few hundred years on either side. Some disagree with that, like Rudolf Steiner, but in general, most believe that that started around the time of Christ. And you see an extraordinary confluence of symbols associated with Pisces in terms of Christianity. The reason I picked Christianity, you see, when an age begins, it affects the whole world. It's not just one culture. However, like that William Gibson line that I started with, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So in other words, you have the influence of the ages all over, but it's primarily in a certain area. Another example of that, because this is true of all astrology really, like the events of 9/11 and the Twin Towers, for instance. Now, most astrologers will tend to agree that was primarily the result of Saturn opposing Pluto in 2001. Now, I talked to a skeptic once, and he said, well, why didn't that aspect affect the entire planet? Well, it did, but it was concentrated primarily in Manhattan. All aspects, like when the Watergate scandal happened, it happened primarily in Washington. Things like that. These aspects tend to converge in a certain spot. And Christianity isn't the only place that the Piscean age influence manifested, but it was probably the most obvious. So you have the fish symbolism, ichthys. And so I remember reading a skeptical comment about how the Piscean symbolism was one fish, not two fish like Pisces, which isn't true. You do have examples in early Christianity of the double fish, like in the sign of Pisces. That's off of the stained glass window in Chartres Cathedral. Walking on water, that's a classic. Pisces is a water sign, the notion of rising above the water. Turning of water into wine. You know, wine is a Neptunian Piscean symbol. The charity, the helping of the dispossessed, the outcasts of society, that's also a very Piscean sort of thing. Washing of feet. The feet are the part of the body that is ruled by Pisces. Baptism, again, another water symbol associated with Pisces. Purification by water. Now, the question arises, were these correspondences to the age of Pisces in Christianity intentional or not? And there's three possible explanations for that. One is that, yes, they were fully aware of the astrological notion of the great ages. This is very controversial because academics, mainstream academics, believe, no, we knew of precession of the equinox going back to Hipparchus around 127 BC, but that wasn't coupled, according to the academics, with the notion of the astrological ages till much later, maybe the 1790s and the 1800s. There's a lot of controversy about that. You have a lot of independent scholars like David Ulansey, who believes that the Mithraic mysteries show an understanding of the astrological ages. You've got Graham Hancock. You've got the book Hamlet's Mill by Hertha von Deckend and Giorgio de Santillana, who claim that it goes back thousands and thousands of years. You know, I'm not here to debate that. It's just I'm making you aware that there's controversy about this. The other possible thing here with that is, no, they weren't aware of it. The church fathers weren't aware of it, but that didn't matter because the effect could still occur since astrological influence doesn't require conscious knowledge of it to work. In other words, astrology works whether you believe it or not. For instance, one of the things that people like Swaller de Lubitsch and John Anthony West talk about is that if you go look into ancient Egypt, you see a shift in the iconography of ancient Egypt around the time that it shifted from the age of Taurus to the age of Aries. You saw a shift from bull symbolism to ram symbolism with the New Kingdom, for example. Now, no academic, no mainstream academic will tell you that the ancient Egyptians understood the astrological ages like we do. Again, that's the debatable point. But it doesn't matter whether the Egyptians understood it if you believe in astrology and whether it has an influence on you, or whether you believe in it or not. You know, if you have a Mars squaring your moon, it's going to affect you. Whether, if just 2 days of the month, Kriyananda made a funny comment once. I thought it was funny. He said, Goswami Kriyananda from the city who I studied with. He said that if someone doesn't believe in astrology, just tell them when Mars is squaring their moon, and they'll realize how powerful astrology is. No matter how balanced you think you are, you're going to be irritable for 2 days. Third thing here is the church fathers didn't base their Piscean symbolism on the great ages at all, or precession. They based it on the fact that in 7 BC there was a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the sign of Pisces. And so it was a way to commemorate that conjunction that is sometimes associated with the star of Bethlehem. You know, that idea of an omen showing a great, teacher. So, again, even though I tend to go with the first two, basically speaking, I think that it's whether they knew of it or not, it still had an influence. Now, what is the legacy of the Piscean age? And one of the things I want to try to convey here tonight is there's a tendency to look at this very simplistically. Is the Piscean age good or bad? My answer is yes. In other words, you tend to see a lot of ambiguity. You see a lot of good and bad both. It's not just one or the other. And this is true for anything in astrology. Take the sun sign Pisces, for example. On the one hand, you've got someone that embodies maybe the higher aspect of Pisces, like Michelangelo or Edgar Cayce, and then you've got John Wayne Gacy. That's Pisces. That's both sides of Pisces. Okay? It's the same sign, but different octaves of the same energy. So what I want to do here is first go through some of the basic symbols and then cover some of the higher and lower potentials of the sign. It's a water sign, so some astrologers like to talk about the fact that you've got this age of sea exploration, great sea exploration. But that's the exoteric symbol. What does water symbolize as a psychological factor? Emotions. So it's an age of heightened emotions, of sensitivity, and in Christianity, it also has to do with compassion. Pisces, like I said before, is that compassion for the outcast, for the dispossessed in society, a sense of love. There was a shift from an eye for an eye in the Aries age to turning the other cheek in the Pisces age. And I'm talking in generalities here. I hope you understand that, because the Aries age wasn't all pure Aries and the Piscean age wasn't all pure Pisces. There's a lot of complexities here. But another thing you see, well, this was how Joseph Campbell put it. In one of his books, he talked about, he came up with this palindrome, which expresses the shift from the Roman Empire, which really was the pinnacle of the Aries age, the Empire age, into the Piscean age, although he didn't talk in astrological terms, although he did know some astrology, from Roma to Amor. And this expressed itself, too, in terms of a certain compassion for animals. In ancient times, I don't know how many of you know this, but in ancient times, religion was practically synonymous with animal sacrifice. And that basically started to change a few hundred years before Jesus. And it came to a head with Buddhism, Christianity, and what's the other one I'm forgetting? No, Islam is more complex, actually. It's very complex, their attitudes towards, Judaism. Because like with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, that was like a turning point in Judaism in terms of, certain practices like this. And yes, you still have, animal farming, and you still have people eating meat. But in terms of the connection to religion, basically starting with the Piscean age, you have this diminution of animal sacrifice. The ethos of charity and helping of the downtrodden. And that isn't just a Christian thing. That's also in Islam. You also see it in... And by the way, do you know what Islam means? Who knows what the word translates as?
Surrender.
Surrender, submission, which is a very Piscean sort of thing. That's not an Aries word, believe me. Are there any Aries in the room? I don't mean that as it... But you also see that sense of charity and kindness in the Buddhist tradition. The tradition of courtly love, the romanticizing of love, and the idealizing of the feminine, which arose in the late 11th century out of the cult of the Virgin. Very Piscean, that sense of that romantic sort of attitude towards love, which really hadn't existed before in any mass way. The other thing about Pisces is it's a feminine sign. And you have polarities in signs. You've got masculine polarity signs like Aries, Gemini, Leo, Libra, Sagittarius, Aquarius. And then you've got feminine signs, which is like Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, Scorpio, Capricorn, and Pisces. What that means is masculine signs are extroverted. They're more outgoing. Feminine signs are more internalized. They have more to do with the inner life. And Pisces is a very, very internalized sort of emotional sign. And Joseph Campbell talked in one of his books about the rise of the dome was a very profound symbol, because you have it in both Islam and Christianity, that came in roughly with the age of Pisces, this sense of an interiority. It was not, there may have been examples of domes in isolated places before, but it really came in as a major movement in the age of Pisces. The sense of an interior universe. And so you had, during the age of Pisces, I consider it the age of great artistic geniuses, musical geniuses like Bach. Or you take, for example, Michelangelo, the likes of which we may never see people like this again. But it's also the age of great mystical geniuses. And I think, again, when we get more perspective a few thousand years from now, I think we're going to realize just what the Piscean age gave us in terms of the mystical and spiritual teachings. This is Dogen in the Buddhist tradition. That's the extraordinary metaphysical and mystical genius Plotinus in the Neoplatonic tradition. That's Meister Eckhart, the German mystic. That's Rumi. And then you've got, in a broader sense, this flourishing of esoteric, mystical, spiritual traditions during the Piscean age, some of which were developments from the previous age, but some of which were new. So, for example, you've got Hermeticism, Gnosticism, magic, which had always existed, but it flourished in the age of Pisces on a very broad scale. Kabbalah, alchemy, sacred geometry. Like you take, for example, the knowledge that went into the great cathedrals. This is Chartres. And the underground stream of information and knowledge and mystical insight that went into the cathedrals, which I don't think was written down, I'm not sure about that, or at least if it was, we don't have the documents anymore. But this is, when you think of the extraordinary, if you've been inside any of these cathedrals, it's an incredible thing to experience the ambience. There's something truly mystical about those spaces. On the other hand, the dark side of the age of Pisces. Holy war, jihad. It wasn't just Islam, you had that also with the Crusades, of course. Pisces is like Sagittarius, they're both Jupiter related. In the case of Pisces, it's Jupiter and Neptune, in my opinion. There's disagreement about the new rulerships and the old. I'm not going to get into that. But let's just stick with Jupiter for the time being. There's a sense, the dark side of Jupiter is dogma. It's kind of this evangelical fervor energy. You're burning people at the stake because they don't agree with you or for some other kind of ideological reason. Self-flagellation, self-denial. The Piscean Virgo axis, because every sign has its opposite energy, as we're going to talk about a little more here shortly. The Pisces-Virgo axis has a lot to do on the positive side with self-surrender, but on the negative side, self-denial, self-negation. It's like self-flagellation. And it's not just Christianity. You have that sects in Islam as well that do that. Now, this is a subtle but very important point. I talked about the dome and the interior awakening of an interior universe that happened with the age of Pisces. The dark side of that, well, it was an awakening of conscience, you might say. And if you look at the way rituals were conducted, let's say in ancient Greek times versus, what happened in Christianity, there's an interesting difference. But you have this rise of guilt in the Piscean age. Now you have shame before, like if you talk to anthropologists, thousands of years you can go back and you find shame cultures. And there's a difference between shame and guilt. Does anybody know what that is?
Socially dictated?
Yeah.
Guilt is internal?
Yeah, it's like shame is like losing face. It's more of an external thing, whereas guilt is like an internal sort of angsting. And that really is something associated with the age of Pisces, with the last 2,000 years, and Christianity in particular. And the other thing with the age of Pisces, heaven is somewhere else. It's not down here. I mean, that's not true in the Gnostic sects, like in the Gospel of Thomas, but you have that as a general rule. It's that sense of this is a veil of tears, and when we die, we're going to go to the good place, And you have that in Islam in terms of the 72 virgins, for example. And in the darker aspects of the Gnostic tradition, I call the darker aspects, it's or certainly the Sethian aspects of Gnosticism, you have this notion of the world is a prison, the universe is a prison from which we're trying to escape, that's a very Piscean sort of it's a dualistic sort of perspective. Every age has certain key defining symbols. And the defining symbol of the Piscean age, along with fish, I suppose, would be the crucifixion. It embodies the best and the worst of the age of Pisces. The best is the sense of sacrifice, transcending the ego, surrendering one's will for the higher good. The negative is victimization. It's martyrdom, persecution, self-denial, equating spirituality with suffering. If you see a chart, for example, with a very heavy Pisces-Virgo axis, you often see this sense of self-persecution of, pound another nail in me. It's you have to look at the aspects, all the aspects. But there can be, there is certain negativity that, has to be overcome. And at the end, as you get towards the end of the age of Pisces, it's interesting, you see this political movement come up with the twisted cross. It's almost like it was the climactic perversion of that original seed impulse of what Pisces represented. Now, the interesting thing about the Nazi Party was it was really a blend of the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius. The high-tech aspect of it, the progressive aspect of it in terms of technology and, rocketry and, all these different things they were doing on the technological level, that was Aquarian. But the basic persecutional side of it and the racial intolerance, for instance, was very, very Piscean. Now, the age of Aquarius, that brings us up to this point. You see, there's the figure of Ganymede. We base the age, our understanding of Aquarius is primarily from the Greek tradition of the myth of Ganymede, who was a mortal, who was abducted into the heavens to serve as cupbearer for the gods. Something we're going to come back to in just a little bit here. So when does it begin? This is an ongoing thing. I tend to be in the minority amongst astrologers. I may be a minority of one, in that I don't believe that you can pin it down to a year or a date, certainly. It's like, for example, we had this Pluto-Neptune conjunction in 1892, 1893. And if someone asked you, when did the influence of that aspect begin? That happens every 500 years, that particular aspect. You can't say it begins on a day or a year. It was years on either side. And the ages, we're talking about a 26,000-year cycle. And in terms of the overall 12 ages, each age being roughly 2,100 years. And so you cannot say, for example, like when does the dawn begin? Is it when the glow starts arising over the horizon? Is it when the sun actually pops up? You know, you can't pin it down to a moment. Another way to think of it is in terms of the tide. When does the tide come in? Is there a minute that it comes in? Is there an hour that it comes in? It comes in waves. And great ages are like that. They're like the tide. They come in waves. And so you can't talk about a single date or year that it starts, but you can talk about the waves. You can talk about certain times when the age is like thrusting forward into manifestation. And these are just a couple, these are not a couple, these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These are a few of the dates of the periods that I would choose as particularly significant waves when the age was like, making itself more apparent. They're not the only ones. There are waves happening all the time of greater or lesser magnitude. The first major one, in my opinion, not the only one, the discovery of Uranus in 1781. And I do believe Uranus is the co-ruler of Aquarius. Again, there's debate about this in the astrological community. And if you doubt whether Uranus is even a co-ruler of Aquarius, I would ask you, take, for example, people like Huey Newton and Jules Verne and Thomas Edison and Charles Lindbergh, and I could go on, Johnny Rotten, James Dean. Those are all Aquarians. Are they more Uranian or Saturnian? They're definitely not Saturnians. So I think you have to look at both Uranus and Saturn as a ruler of Aquarius. So during the discovery of 1781 of Uranus, you have this rise of modern democracy. You have the Industrial Revolution during that general period. You've got the rise of aviation with the Montgolfier brothers in 1783. The rise of capitalism, modern capitalism. The first return of Uranus at that discovery point in 1860 was actually 1863, and that was the year of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's also the year that Jules Verne wrote the book 6 Weeks in a Balloon. From the Earth to the Moon, he did that in 1865, I believe. The Civil War during that general period, of course, and the freeing of the serfs in Russia. It wasn't just America that had the emancipation energy going. 1890s, the Pluto-Neptune conjunction. That's a whole lecture in itself. We can't go into that. But I can talk about 1947, the second return of Uranus at that discovery point, that was the year of the birth of the world's largest democracy with the India independence. That was also a period when there was major advances in rocketry, major advances in the atomic research, for example. The second return of Uranus to the discovery point happened within several days of the Roswell incident. Now that's an interesting tidbit. And there's many other things that happened, the forming of the CIA, the American Air Force, etc. 1960s, those of us that are old enough to remember that, the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and a very explosive, extraordinary energy in the 60s that you can't, if you weren't there, you really can't describe it. It was an extraordinary kind of, both scary and very exciting at the same time. 1990s, the Uranus-Neptune conjunction that happens, I believe it's every 150 years or 120, I'm not sure. And then the third return of Uranus to the discovery point will be around 2031. And we don't yet know what's going to happen, but you can get some clues by looking at the previous times that happened. Technological advancements, aviation, the Roswell incident is an interesting thing to contemplate in that light. What will the Aquarian age mean? Again, like I said before, I'm not as interested in the technical side of the astronomy, the astrophysics of the ages. I'm interested in what this is manifesting as in our world. So, for example, there are 3 keys that I use to understand what this is about. The first is the air element. The second is the chakric symbolism. The third is the Leo-Aquarius polarity. Let me go through each of those briefly. So, for example, the air element. Now, just in the same way that the exoteric side of the age of Pisces brought us exploration in the oceans, you have air travel. You have this extraordinary rise in such a short time of aviation. Interestingly, the Wright brothers, when they took off at Kitty Hawk, that was when Uranus reached the opposite point of that discovery point. So again, every time you see those triggers of that discovery point, you see some interesting things happen with technology and aviation in particular. But what does air symbolize esoterically? I asked you before what water symbolizes. What does air symbolize psychologically?
Intelligence.
I'm sorry, what?
Intelligence.
Intelligence. Another word for that? Mind, rationality, mentality. So, for example, and I think it also relates to the space age, by the way, even though that's beyond the atmosphere, it's the same symbolism, basically. The mind, the rise of intelligence in terms of more of an emphasis on intelligence. There's always been intelligence, obviously, but this is where it takes on a mass role in the shaping of society. There are 3 air signs, though, and this is important to understand in terms of the symbolism of each element. Gemini is mind in its most personal form. It's like the way your own thoughts work, the way your mind works personally. Libra is interpersonal mind. It's how your mind works in relation to people. That's why you often see it in the charts of performers or public speakers, that sort of thing. How you relate to others. And Aquarius is transpersonal mind. It's collective mind. And what does that mean? We're talking about information that is not personal. It's information that is universal, cosmic, information that that's impersonal. So, for instance, it has a lot to do with science. Like scientific truths are not personal truths. They're shared collective truths, things that people have come up with and through peer review and that sort of thing and experimentation, you test it out and everybody tends to agree with it, more or less. Versus, let's say, your personal opinions, like gossip, that's more of a Gemini sort of thing, where you're talking about things that don't have universal significance, presumably. Scientific research is very Aquarian in that sense. Now, Aquarius and the chakra system, this is something I learned, as I've talked about this in almost all of my lectures here. In Kriya Yoga, they talk about how the chakras relate to the signs and the signs relate to the chakras. The outer universe reflects the inner universe. So, for example, if you spin the zodiac around so that Leo and Cancer are at the top, you see this extraordinary alignment of the signs with the traditional rulers up the middle reflecting the different chakras. For example, at the bottom there you've got Saturn, which relates to Muladhara, the root chakra, the material, grounded sort of energy. Then you've got Jupiter representing Svadhisthana, ruling the 2 signs, Sagittarius and Pisces. The water element, the 3rd chakra, Mars, the force, the energy center, ruling by day it rules Aries, by night it rules Scorpio, as Shelley Trimmer used to say. Venus, the Anahata chakra, the heart chakra. Taurus by night, Libra by day. Mercury, Vishuddha chakra, relates to the mind. And Gemini, it rules by day. Virgo, it rules by night. And there's a curious difference here where the sun rules the chakra in the forehead, the 3rd eye, and the moon rules the chakra in the back of the head called Chandra chakra. And those of you that know traditional astrology will know that this is similar to something called the thema mundi in classical astrology. But it's an astonishingly precise sort of correlation, which is one of the reasons why I don't believe that the zodiac is some cultural fabrication. I do believe it's like a universal sort of cosmic archetypal pattern. I asked a question in a lecture I gave here many years ago. I said, was the zodiac invented or discovered? You know, if it was discovered, it's an archetypal universal pattern. If it was invented, that means it's just a cultural fabrication, which I don't buy at all. Okay, the Leo-Aquarius polarity. Every sign has its polarity, like we talked about Pisces-Virgo for the Piscean age. Well, during the Aquarian age, it's Aquarius-Leo. You know, the Leo represents, if you think in terms of the chakras, it relates to the third eye. And Aquarius relates to the root chakra. It relates to the material plane. It's like bringing down the fire of the gods. The way I refer to it in the book, Signs of the Times, is drawing down the fire of the gods. There's a sense of intellectually or technologically bringing the spark of Leo, whether you think of that in terms of the ego or whether you think of that in terms of some kind of divine energy, creative energy, down into practical manifestation. The most obvious symbol of that is solar power, in terms of the drawing down of the sun energy into practical application. It's also atomic energy. It's tapping literally the power of the sun, the fusion of the solar principle into a practical application. You also see it with Tesla, that sense of tapping into the universal energies. And the famous image of Ben Franklin drawing down the energy of lightning. And Ben Franklin had a Uranus. He was, I believe, a Capricorn, but he had a Uranus opposing Mercury. There was a very strong Uranus quality about his horoscope and his life. But that drawing down of the energy from above, so to speak, it manifests in all sorts of ways in terms of the world. For example, you see it in politics with democracy, with people power, taking the power that had previously been in the hands of kings and queens and popes and bringing it down to ordinary people. Ideally, anyway, I'm talking in generalities here. You see it with capitalism, with that sense of taking wealth out of the hands of just the kings, queens, and popes, and now being able to, for average entrepreneurs, you have this ability to kind of generate your own wealth, ideally anyway. On a psychological level, you have this sense of personal empowerment with that Aquarius-Leo axis, that sense of awakening the giant within, you know, that sense of the unlimited possibilities. And that translates over into the Horatio Alger mythos, this notion that you can rise yourself up and become something more than just your lowly origins. That's not a Pisces-Virgo energy at all. Neither is that Tony Robbins type of energy. That's strictly Aquarius-Leo. And that also manifests in terms of that star quality. The sun is a star, so that every person can become a star, so to speak, whether it's through Facebook or being a performer, going on American Idol. David Bowie had that great line about we can be heroes, I think it is. And Andy Warhol was a Leo, by the way, and he had that notion that everybody can have their 15 minutes of fame. Nietzsche tapped into this in his own way. He tapped into that sense of this emerging sense of the Übermensch, the overman, although it's come down to us as the Superman principle, the sense of this possible human, possible humanity, in which God kind of becomes eclipsed in the background and humanity rises to the foreground. And this is a image by William Blake that I think expresses that sense, that Aquarius-Leo sense of humans rising up to kind of, become the principle, the dominant principle. Now, what could go wrong with this sort of tapping into the powers, whether you're talking about the technological powers or the psychological powers? On the one hand, you have atomic power, which is what can happen when you play with fire a little too much. And on the right there, you see what happens when you play with that psychological fire. Remember, Hitler was a failed artist, and he rose up out of very lowly beginnings to practically destroy the whole world. That Horatio Alger myth gone wrong, so to speak, where you can lift yourself up by the bootstraps and make something of yourself, but not necessarily for the better. But this is a very important part of that Leo Aquarius principle, decentralization. Now let me explain what that means. In the body, Leo rules the heart. The heart is the organ of the body where everything converges to a central point. Aquarius rules the distribution of the blood through the arterial system. It's decentralizing that energy, that principle, and that expresses itself in all sorts of ways with what's happening in culture, that sense of multiple centers. It's not a centralizing principle. It's like a decentralizing principle. So, for example, over the last 500 years, modern history, to some extent, has been a progressive decentralizing of the world of culture in various ways. Copernicus decentralized the universe in terms of saying the earth was not the center. Martin Luther decentralized religion by saying that the Catholic Church wasn't the only, religion, the only faith. Democracy centralized power from the monarchs down into average people. Capitalism decentralized wealth from the people at the top to the people at the bottom, ideally. Darwin decentralized humanity. We no longer were the center of existence. We were just one of the many kind of crews on the evolutionary ladder. Freud decentralized the ego. The ego had been everything up till Freud, and I'm generalizing, but it's basically accurate. Freud said the ego is just like an island in this vast ocean of the unconscious, the subconscious. Picasso decentralized perspective. Edwin Hubble, with the Hubble telescope too, in a way, I guess, but Hubble more or less showed us that our galaxy wasn't even the center of the universe, that there are billions of galaxies out there. Another thing is postmodernism, this idea that there is not just one truth, there's multiple truths. And you see this in culture in various ways, like in films like Citizen Kane, where it's not told from one perspective. The movie is told from multiple perspectives of the people. And he kind of brought that to an iconic head at the end of Lady from Shanghai, where he showed this image of the person from many perspectives. It's a beautiful expression of that decentralization. You also see this in other movies, this multiple perspective approach with Tarantino, let's say with Pulp Fiction or Reservoir Dogs, or with Nashville by, who's the director of Nashville? Altman, yeah, thank you. Future decentralizations. What sort of decentralizations could lie ahead for us? Well, these are just two possibilities I thought of. If we discovered I think we already have, but if we were to get in touch with other civilizations in the universe, that would be a major decentralization. We would realize that our culture is not, all there is in the universe. And I think that's part of the reason. There's various reasons why I think they keep it secret, but I think one of them is I think it would shake people up a bit too much, especially the fundamentalists in different religions. And the discovery of alternate or parallel dimensions, which would be a bit similar. There's a lot of talk about this in physics. Are there other dimensions? Is this just one sliver on this cosmic spectrum? But all of these different trends come together in a way within one particular manifestation, and that's the emergence of the United States. Like I said, when I talked about the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So the Aquarian age is going to manifest everywhere in various ways, but it's particularly manifesting, in my opinion, within the nation of America. And let's go over a few of these things. First of all, this is an image that Salvador Dali did back in the 40s, which I think is quite brilliant. It shows this figure trying to emerge out of the world egg, out of North America specifically. The name of the painting is Geopolitica's Child Watches the Birth of the New Man. And some people think that painting was done in kind of anticipation of the role that America was taking on in World War II and that it would take on after World War II, when it really did become a world power. But notice that, that ominous drop of blood coming down there. All right. America really became a nation, an independent nation, in the same year that Uranus was discovered, 1781. The Declaration of Independence was 1776. That was a conception. But the true severing of the umbilical cord was the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. That really turned the tide of the war, even though it was officially recognized in with the treaty in I think the Treaty of Versailles in 1783, something like that. Look at the motto. This is the Great Seal. I think it was designed in 1782, the next year. And the motto at the bottom, Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new secular order. Some people interpret that as the new order of the ages. Secular, that's an interesting word. It's a non-religious, non-dogmatic sort of creation. We the people, possibly the three most Aquarian words in the English language. That sense of we the people, not me the monarch, or me the Pope. The U.S. wasn't the first democracy, but it was certainly the most influential in the world in terms of how it had spread since the late 1700s, when there was a handful of democracies. And look what's happened, and there's, I think, one over possibly 200 now, in various forms. And whether they're pure democracies or not, I'm talking in the general term of democracy, of people voting for the leader. Now, the thing about the U.S. and democracy is it's not simply mob rule. It's not simply everybody voting and the mob wiping out the individual voice. That's a very interesting distinction, because in the French Revolution, for example, the individual wound up getting wiped out. The people were everything and the individual became nothing. How did America keep that from happening? It's basically from the Bill of Rights and also the Electoral College. But it was a balancing act between the individual and the group. That's the classic dichotomy of Aquarius to Leo. And the archetypal expression of that, in my opinion, is the quintessential American art form, jazz. Now, if you want to understand the difference between the Piscean age and the Aquarian age, look at the difference between the Gregorian choir and the jazz band. In the Gregorian choir, you have everybody pulling their creative efforts towards an ideal, towards a goal, in which the individual isn't supposed to stand out. And it's also for this otherworldly ideal. It's for something, heavenly, you might say. Whereas the jazz band, each person's individuality, each person's creative spirit is intended to shine. Each person is supposed to shine. It's fundamentally different from the Gregorian choir. And it's also very secular. It's very earthy. It's very, root chakra, you might say. And I don't mean that in a bad way. And you see this manifesting, this jazz ideal, in various ways. For example, the United States itself, the different 50 states, are like independent voices in a jazz choir. There's always this tension between states' rights and the federal government. Okay? And it's like the jazz band is not anarchy. It's not each person just doing what they want. There is a structure. There is a Saturn element to Aquarius, just like there is a Uranus element. There's that dance between structure and spontaneity. And likewise, the United States follows a certain piece of sheet music. There is a structure. It's called the Constitution. And likewise with capitalism, that expresses the jazz model in terms of each person can follow their own wealth. Communism is a throwback to the Piscean age. That's the Gregorian choir applied to the economy, because each person's pooling their wealth towards the collective, towards the whole. You're not supposed to really have your own independent wealth. The Edison workshop was a major innovation in terms of it brought together people in a jazz band sort of way. Thomas Edison was like Louis Armstrong, the Leo Louis Armstrong, by the way. And he brought these people together to kind of be creative, including Tesla at one point. Very much of a jazz band applied to innovation and technology. Religious democracy. Now this gets interesting to me. The United States was also a very important influence in terms of freedom of religion. It wasn't freedom from religion. The age of Aquarius is not an atheistic sort of age. It's secular, but it's not atheistic. It's freedom of religion. So you can choose, each person in the United States, technically speaking, unless it changes, which it could, each person is allowed to pursue their own spiritual religious path. So you have all these different faiths that can ideally live side by side, and this expresses itself in various faiths, various religious institutions, of which the Theosophical Society is a good example. It is the jazz principle applied to religion, because people of different faiths can join. And yet they are joined by a certain piece of sheet music called the three objects. But they can improvise their own spiritual paths within that, structure. It's very similar to the Unitarian Universalist in a certain way. I can't go over all these in depth, but if you understand any of these, you know that these are similar. These are not your father's religious paths. These are fairly Aquarian, fairly modern. Same thing with Christian Science, which is a very democratic sort of faith. There's not a pope. Each person has a personal relationship with the divine. Even the title itself is an Aquarius-Pisces blend, Christian Science. Freemasonry, Masonry is very much of an Aquarian sort of ideal. But at its root, we're really talking about, at its core, we're talking about, in terms of the esoteric side of the age of Aquarius with religion, the democratization of divinity, the God in each person, finding that spark within. Now, that was always there in some form or another in most traditional religions, but it could get you burned at the stake if you'd said it, for example, 1,000 years ago in medieval Europe. Nowadays, it's become more commonplace to say God is within. I saw 15 years ago, I remember seeing an episode of Oprah with, I think it was Deepak Chopra, where he said, God is within us, each of us is a God. You could have probably not even said that 50, 60 years ago on mainstream TV. You certainly couldn't say it in medieval Europe, and so that's become a more mainstream idea. And to show you just how mainstream it is, it's really at the core of what I think is the defining myth of the Aquarian age, the Wizard of Oz. Now, as some of you know, L. Frank Baum joined the Theosophical Society in 1892. So he was aware of esoteric ideas. He wrote about, as John Algeo pointed out, he wrote about Theosophy for the Kansas City Star, I think it was, when he was working in Kansas. So he had some familiarity with deeper esoteric ideas, one of which is Blavatsky wrote explicitly about, the God principle within. Now, you look at the story of the Wizard of Oz, you have Dorothy setting out on a classic hero's journey. She's trying to get home, which is, in a Buddhist sense, you might say, trying to get back to her original nature. And she encounters this very Judeo-Christian God, fire and brimstone, this sort of, wrathful deity. But what happens? There's a transformation that occurs. She discovers that this wrathful deity is really just like her, really is just sort of like an ordinary person. And is like more of a brother or sister or co-creator, you might say, than a father figure or certainly a tyrant. And if I can't go into my work about Shelley Trimmer that I spoke about here last time, but there's deeper levels to this in terms of how you could even take this as far as what this implies about a change in theology of, the God principle. And Carl Jung talked about the transformation of the God image in terms of an interiorizing of the God image. The other level of the Wizard of Oz is they come up to this so-called deity, the wizard, who's really an ordinary person, though he's exalted in his own way. And they're each looking for something, and each of them finds out that that's within them, that it's not outside of them. All right? And this is the third level, which I think is most interesting of all. This is the jazz principle again. In the ancient mythologies, such as Jason and the Argonauts or Knights of the Round Table, they set out in a quest and they're all looking for the same thing, whether it's the Golden Fleece or the Grail. But in this very unique story, they're each looking for something completely different. The Scarecrow is looking for the brain, the Lion is looking for courage, Dorothy's looking for home, and the Tin Man is looking for heart. And yet they're walking together. It's kind of like the members of Louis Armstrong's jazz band. They're coupled together. And yet, or like the Theosophical Society, for example, yet they're somehow on the same path together. It's an extraordinary piece of symbolism that I think kind of is a forerunner for what's coming up as far as, well, what's already come up in terms of freedom of religion and all this. Now, the future is not just unevenly divided amongst nations or religions, but amongst individuals. In other words, some individuals are more forerunners of the coming age than others. And L. Frank Baum was one of those. He had Sun conjunct Uranus in his chart. So did Walt Disney. Again, this is not a good or a bad thing. I'm just talking about you can have good forerunners, you can have bad forerunners. You could find plenty of good and bad for almost anyone, so I'm not trying to, present this as a spiritual ideal. I'm just saying he was definitely a prophet of the Aquarian age in various ways, such as he had this jazz band work ethic where he brought people together in a kind of a workshop way, like Edison's workshop, had each person throw in their ideas, though he was like the ringleader, like Louis Armstrong. You also see it in terms of his futuristic emphasis, very Aquarian, Sun conjuncting Uranus, Tomorrowland. His media empire, which has just exploded, even since his death, this sense of what the films and the TV shows and, the product lines and all this. But the key symbol of the Disney empire is probably this image from Fantasia. If you go to Disneyland, you'll see Mickey Mouse. A lot of these items with Mickey Mouse dressed up as the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Now, why is that so important? It's basically the Promethean story. Uranus, Rick Tarnas, my friend Rick Tarnas, relates the planet Uranus to the myth of Prometheus, and there's a lot of truth to that, but I see it, and I think he does too, really. I see it as a dichotomy between Uranus, the myth of Uranus, the sky god, tyrannical sky god, and Prometheus, the rebel. The Uranus has that dichotomy. It has, on the one hand, a tyrannical side, like if you know the movie Terminator with Skynet, that's a very Uranian sort of thing. And on the other hand, you've got the rebels. You've got the kind of the Promethean sort of upheaval. And so you have this creature that taps into the powers of heaven, so to speak. And remember, the sorcerer himself actually has a cap with an astrologer symbols on it, like the planets and all that. Another Uranian symbol. And he gets this mechanical contraption, a man-made, a human-made sort of technology, a broom to carry water. Now, where have we seen the water bearer before? It's like it goes right back to the Ganymede. It's the key symbol of the age of Aquarius. And so what happens, he gets this technology, that's the key word here, to do his work for him, to service him. And it gets out of control. And then what starts happening? The water starts rising, okay, to where he gets in trouble. Where have we seen that? That's, it could very well be that this is, what comes up. And maybe that Sorcerer's Apprentice story is an omen of that. Let's hope not. But it sure looks like it is. A couple other things here quickly, other symbols of the Aquarian age, the emerging age. The internet. The internet does not, what's the address of the internet? It does not have an address. It's all over the planet. There may be multiple hubs, but it's not at a single spot. It's technological, it's massive communication, it's a sharing of ideas. And the key embodiment of the internet is probably Facebook. I think Facebook represents the best and the worst of the Aquarian age in a lot of ways. It's mass friendships. Aquarius is very much associations, communities, mass friendships, society. It's also the jazz principle, because it's not like in the old days when I grew up, everybody sat up and watched TV and it was just a one-way thing where you took it in, but there wasn't interaction. With Facebook, there's interaction. It's more of a jazz band sort of thing, for better and worse. It's also very mental. It's very detached. It's not warm. It's not emotional. And that's the paradox of the Aquarian age. You have this interconnection. You're connected to people all over the planet, but you're separate from them. You may know more about the person in Japan that you're communicating with than your next door neighbor. That's the Saturn side of Aquarius, that sense of the walls, that sense of separation. This is a great image by a Polish artist whose name I can't pronounce. You can find this image pretty easily online. He's looking at the world from his prison through the Facebook symbol, and notice the door is open. He's not locked in the room. He could walk outside and go outside if he wanted to. I think that's brilliant. Every age has its own set of challenges, including its own addictions. So, for example, you have, for instance, Marx said that religion was the opiate of the masses. What is the opiate of the Aquarian age? I think this is probably a good way to think of it. That's a symbol. Using technology to kind of reinforce one's own narcissism and one's own kind of, it's the Aquarius-Leo axis again. There's that one too. I love that image. That sense of being addicted to technology, to being connected. You can't be away from your smartphone for, more than a few minutes. I could spend a whole hour talking about the transitional symbols. I'm just going to talk about two. A lot of occultists, I think Leadbeater was one of them, talked about the fact that the shift from the age of Taurus to the age of Pisces manifested partly in the symbolism of Moses casting out the golden calf. You know, he was the Aries symbol and the golden calf representing the age of Taurus, which we're leaving behind. So what's the symbol of casting aside the age of Pisces? Like, what's the great American novel, Moby Dick? This idea of Ahab, and Ahab represented, the whaling industry was really the first major corporate entity in America. And he was killing the whale, which isn't a fish technically, but it's an aquatic creature, obviously. Now, conclusion. The doctrine of the 8 ages, the doctrine of the great ages, I've been saying here, it's a very useful model for understanding history. It's not the only model. You have other ways, both astrological and otherwise. You could talk about the yugas in India, which is another topic. You could talk about, the fact that there have been 200 ages of Aquarius in the last 5 million years. You know, what other dynamics are involved there? Because it's not simply a matter of the age repeating itself every time. There's going to be differences. The age of Aquarius in the Neanderthal era was not the same as the age of Aquarius that's coming up for us now. Or you take the movement of the vernal point across the stars and the constellations, which, if you go strictly by that, the age of Aquarius isn't starting for a few hundred years. I don't happen to think that's the only barometer, though. But you can't approach it simplistically. If someone went back in time, let's say you went back in time 2,000 years and you spoke to someone around the time of Christ and you said you were from the future, the year 2018, and they said, what's going to happen over the next 2,000 years? Would you talk about the Renaissance or the Inquisition? Would you talk about, Torquemada or St. Francis of Assisi? It's all of these things. Every age is a mosaic of possibilities. But what we can do is talk about certain general themes. So, to start wrapping up here, some of the positive themes of the Aquarian age: rationality, vast knowledge, unlocking nature's secrets, multiculturalism, diversity, personal empowerment, a society of kings, as my friend Lawrence Hillman likes to put it, and queens, women's rights, the collective as a force for change. On the not so pleasant side, superficiality and empty entertainments, an increasingly mechanized, depersonalized world, a world dominated by corporations, the challenge of the herd mentality, the loss of personal privacy. And when I was preparing the lecture, I came across this image. This is George Orwell's. I couldn't resist sharing this. This is George Orwell's, where he lived when he was writing, and there's a surveillance camera out front. You can't make this stuff up. But this is, I think, also a very important point. The highest potentials of any age are always limited to a relative few. You had, let's say, for every St. Francis of Assisi during the Piscean age, you had millions and millions of ordinary people, if not, criminals and ruffians thrown in. And likewise, the age of Aquarius, you're going to have your Einsteins, you're going to have your Steve Jobs, your Martin Luther Kings. But it's on the mass level, it's very possible it could go this way as well, in terms of what the majority leans towards. Empty entertainments, mass consumerism, the herd mentality. So the question I would leave you with is, are you going to be one of the few or one of the many? Which way are you going to take it?
So you had mentioned many examples of the age of Aquarius that are coming up or that are present now. Can you say any examples regarding the sign of Leo that would be coming up for the age of Aquarius?
Well, actually, that was implicit in some of what I was saying in terms of, like, everybody becomes a creator. Everybody, you see this thing about the apps on the phones where everybody can become an artist or a photographer. That's very much of an Aquarius-Leo thing. You also see it, I think, I wish I could have gone into this, but I've had this involvement with Egypt. I lectured here last year, I think it was, on Egypt. And I happen to think that the Sphinx could become a very important symbol for the Aquarian age in some ways, because it represents the head of a person in the body of a lion. And in terms of what my friend Lawrence Hillman said about a society of kings, each person tapping into their own kingship, their own queenship, that personal power. But also any person can rise up and become, a president or a dictator or whatever it is, if they play their cards right. So those are the main things I would say. But I think tapping into the personal creativity, also the pleasure principle, life, liberty, and the pursuit of pleasure, and the pursuit of happiness, essentially. Yeah, that is not a Pisces age sort of energy. That's strictly an Aquarian Leo energy, the Leo being the fun principle, the pleasure principle. And so it's where everybody has the right to a vacation. Everybody has the right to go to Disneyland. Everybody has the right to go, to an amusement park, for example. That's an Aquarius Leo sort of dynamic. Does that answer your question at all? Sure. Okay. And also what Andy Warhol said about every person has their 15 minutes, or what David Bowie said, every person can become a hero. That's Aquarius Leo.
With the scuttlebutt and all this talk about the 2020 conjunctions, including
Right.
Pluto, do you see that as another portal into the Aquarian age?
Even more so the Jupiter-Saturn in 0 degrees of Aquarius that's coming up. Is it December of 2020 or something like that? I forget the date on that. Yeah, so the shifting into the element of air in Aquarius in particular, 0 degrees of Aquarius, I think that's very significant. Even more so in some ways than the Pluto-Saturn in Capricorn that's coming up. But I think any major aspect, like 9/11, for example, that was under Saturn opposing Pluto. And you think of that was one of those transitional symbols where you had the Islamic fundamentalists. I'm talking about, at least the way the media presented the whole story. The Islamic fundamentalists, that's a very Piscean age, dogmatic sort of religious energy versus the corporate hub of the U.S., which is the Aquarian, the high-tech corporate part of the U.S. It's the old age versus the new. Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about the water element in Pisces, but Aquarius is the water bearer.
Yeah, but it's not.
Right.
But that's kind of a misnomer. It's not water. It's kind of like the etheric waters.
Okay.
At least that's the way I was taught.
Good.
In other words, it is an air sign.
Right.
But like if you look at the, I can't go all the way back. Well, maybe I can. If you go back to the image that Joffre did, it's pretty nice because if you look at it carefully. I don't mean to cause you to hallucinate here, but we're just about there. There. Notice it's not real water that's coming out of the jug. It's like this, etheric water, which I think you could relate to electricity. You could relate it to prana. So that's my take on it.
Can you comment on the political climate today with regard to all of this that you're talking about? I mean, I would think you could say something.
Well, it's tricky. For a number of reasons, it's tricky. I think it's very complex what's happening because when there's a dialectic that happens. Like Trump has Sun conjuncting Uranus, for example. So does Giuliani. So there's that very strong sense of the media orientation, the media showman, shaking things up. I think that there's a dynamic where on the one hand, you have one extreme that triggers the other extreme. So on the one hand, Trump represents one set of ideals, but he's also helping to bring an opposite set of ideals in terms of the progressive movement and the Democrats and all this. So I can't boil it down too simply in like a soundbite here. If I had an hour, I could talk about it a bit more, but I'm a little wary of trying to wade into those waters for a couple of reasons. It's also a bit volatile, as you can imagine.
I know. I think I heard one of the ladies saying she would like to hear the talk again. Meaning, obviously, there's a lot of information, and the talk is recorded. It was streamed live. As soon as it's processed, it'll be put up on our YouTube channel where you can watch it again.
It'll be on YouTube.
That'll probably be in a couple of weeks. It'll be posted on the Theosophical Society YouTube channel, where there are many other recordings of previous lectures given by a variety of people.
It's a lot of information. And it's not really meant for one listening. So if you do get a chance to watch it on YouTube again, I recommend that because it's too much to take in, I realize.
Will something be passing away with the Piscean age? Like, you know, there were the false gods that preceded.
Yeah.
Will
Well,
something leave? Like, because the Catholic Church seems to be
something
undergoing-
always leaves, but I don't think, some people say it might be the eradication of religion or Christianity. That's not the way it is. I think, for example, Judaism is an Aries age religion, and that's still here. And likewise, I think, but it's transformed. And likewise, Christianity and Islam, I think, are always going to be here, but they're going to be transformed. Another passing away, for example, some astrologers have said that with the passing of the age of Pisces, we're going to see the end of oil as an energy source and the movement to renewables, especially solar power. That would be an example of what you're talking about. You know, so certain institutions and certain symbols are going to fade. It may even be, or at the rate we're going now, it could be the death of fish in the ocean. You know, I mean, it's at the rate at which aquatic species are dying off is extraordinary in things like Fukushima. So it could literally be the death of fish, if not totally, certainly on a bigger scale. You know, so some of the things that pass away are good. Like, for example, it could be the passing away of capital punishment and the passing away of maybe there's going to be prison reforms. So I think there's good and bad things that pass away.